The crimson sun hung low over the sprawling hills of Ouagadougou, casting long shadows across the ancient baobab trees that had witnessed centuries of struggle and triumph. The air was thick with dust and anticipation as thousands gathered in. Place de la Nation, the heart of Burkina Faso's capital. Street vendors hurried to close their stalls, mothers clutched their children closer, and old men leaned on weathered walking sticks, all drawn by an inexplicable pull toward the presidential palace. President Ibrahim Traoré stood at the tall windows of his office, watching the crowd swell like a river during the rainy season. His reflection stared back at him, a man in his 30s bearing the weight of a nation on his shoulders. The military fatigues he wore were simple, unadorned except for the flag of Burkina Faso pinned over his heart. His eyes, dark and intense, held secrets that would soon shake the foundations of international diplomacy. "Mr. President," came a soft voice from behind him. His chief of staff, Colonel Amadou Diabaté, approached with measured steps. "The broadcasting equipment is ready. The international media has been notified. CNN, BBC, France 24, they're all standing by." Ibrahim turned slowly, his calloused hands clasped behind his back. "And our security?" "Tripled, sir." "But—" Diabaté hesitated. "Sir, are you certain about this? Once you say these words, there's no going back. The world will never be the same." A grim smile crossed Ibrahim's face. "The world was never what we thought it was, Amadou. We're simply removing the mask." 30. Minutes later, Ibrahim emerged onto the palace balcony. The crowd's roar was deafening, a mixture of hope, desperation, and unwavering loyalty. News cameras from around the globe focused on his figure as he raised his hand for silence. The evening call to prayer from nearby mosques had just ended, leaving an almost sacred stillness in the air. "My people," Ibrahim began, his voice carrying across the square through speakers and broadcast stations worldwide. "For too long, we have been told that help comes from those who claim to care about us. We have opened our doors, our hearts, and our nation to those who promised healing and progress." He paused, scanning the sea of faces before him. Children sat on their fathers' shoulders, women in colorful head wraps pressed closer to hear. Young men with hope burning in their eyes hung on every word. "But tonight, I stand before you not just as your president, but as a son of Africa who has discovered a truth so devastating, so shocking, that it will change how we see the world forever." The crowd stirred uneasily. International journalists leaned forward in their press section, sensing something extraordinary was about to unfold. "We have uncovered a network," Ibrahim continued, his voice gaining strength. "A network that has operated in our country for years, hiding behind the sacred mask of humanitarian aid. They came as doctors, teachers, engineers, and aid workers. They spoke of partnership and development, but they were not here to heal. They were here to spy, to steal, and to sabotage our sovereignty." Gasps rippled through the crowd like wind, through grain fields. In television studios across the world, anchors straightened in their chairs. At UN headquarters in New York, emergency meetings began as officials watched the live feed with growing alarm. Ibrahim reached into his jacket and withdrew a small device, a digital recorder that seemed insignificant, but carried the weight of revelation. For months, our intelligence services have worked tirelessly to uncover the truth. What we found will shock you. These so-called humanitarian workers have been conducting espionage operations, meeting with enemies of our state, and plotting not just against Burkina Faso, but against the entire Sahel region. He held up the recorder, and his voice dropped to almost a whisper, forcing everyone to lean in. Listen to their own words. The speakers crackled to life with a recording of voices speaking in accented English. "The elections are next year. We need to ensure Traore doesn't get a second term. The mining rights are too valuable to let slip. What about the northern provinces? The lithium deposits there could power our technology sector for decades. Don't worry about that. We have assets in place. A few well-placed incidents, some media coverage about instability. The international community will demand intervention. And if he resists, then we eliminate him. It's been done before. No one will question another coup in Africa. The recording ended in absolute silence. For a moment, even the evening breeze seemed to hold its breath. Then, like a dam bursting, the crowd erupted in shouts of anger, disbelief, and rage. Ibrahim raised his hand again. "This is not aid," he declared, his voice now thundering across the square. "This is economic colonialism wrapped in the flag of humanitarianism. This is war by deception." As his words echoed through the night, satellite feeds carried the message across continents. In foreign ministries, from London to Washington, from Paris to Beijing, phones rang urgently. Diplomats scrambled for responses, damage control strategies, and explanations. But Ibrahim was far from finished. "But voice recordings can be faked," Ibrahim continued, anticipating the skepticism that would inevitably follow. "So let me show you more." Behind him, a massive screen descended, displaying satellite imagery with startling clarity. The crowd fell silent again, mesmerized by what they were seeing. This is a compound 30 kilometers northeast of our capital, officially registered as a medical supply warehouse operated by Global Health Alliance, a subsidiary of UN humanitarian operations. The image zoomed in, revealing building layouts, vehicle patterns, and movement tracks. But watch this footage captured by our surveillance teams. The video showed armed men in civilian clothing entering and exiting the compound, vehicles with hidden compartments being loaded with equipment that definitely wasn't medical supplies, and late-night meetings between people who were clearly not discussing patient care. "Medical supplies," Ibrahim said with bitter irony. "That include encrypted communication devices, surveillance equipment, and weapons designed to arm insurgent groups in our neighboring countries." The evidence was overwhelming. More footage showed supply convoys being diverted to rebel camps, humanitarian workers meeting with known terrorist operatives, and financial transactions linking the aid organizations to foreign intelligence agencies. In the crowd, an elderly woman named Fatima began to weep. She had lost her son to insurgent attacks 2 years ago, attacks that now appeared to have been orchestrated by the very people claiming to help her country. Her tears were shared by thousands who suddenly understood the true cost of this betrayal. "For years," Ibrahim continued, his voice heavy with emotion, "we wondered why peace seemed so elusive, why every step forward was followed by 2 steps back, why our natural resources continued to flow out of our country while our people remained poor. Now we know." The screen shifted to display financial records, complex webs of transactions, showing how Burkina Faso's gold, uranium, and newly discovered lithium deposits were being systematically extracted through shell companies connected to the humanitarian organizations. "They didn't come to develop our economy," Ibrahim said. "They came to control it, to ensure that Africa remains a source of raw materials for their factories while we remain consumers of their finished products." A new voice suddenly cut through the tension, clear, commanding, and unmistakably feminine. From the shadows beside the palace entrance, a woman stepped into the light. She was tall, elegant, with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. Her traditional Burkinabe dress was complemented by modern accessories that hinted at her dual nature, rooted in African tradition but shaped by global experience. "My fellow Africans," she said, approaching the microphone, "my name is Amara, Sawadogo. For the past 5 years, I have worked undercover within these organizations, gathering evidence, documenting their crimes, and waiting for this moment." The crowd buzzed with surprise and intrigue. Who was this woman who had risked everything to expose the truth? "I was recruited by the Global Health Alliance fresh out of university in Geneva," Amara continued. They told me I would help save lives in Africa. Instead, I found myself documenting how lives were being destroyed for profit. She gestured toward the screen, which now displayed her own hidden camera footage from inside the humanitarian compounds. I watched as medical supplies were deliberately diverted from areas affected by disease outbreaks. I saw how educational programs were designed not to empower African children, but to create dependency on foreign expertise. I witnessed the systematic recruitment of local officials into networks of corruption and control. The footage was damning. Secret meetings in air-conditioned offices while children died of preventable diseases outside. Spreadsheets calculating the optimal level of aid needed to maintain dependency without triggering rebellion. Most shocking of all, recorded conversations about managing African expectations and ensuring that they never developed the capacity to be truly independent. As Amara spoke, the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. The network wasn't just about Burkina Faso. It was a continental operation designed to maintain Africa's position as a supplier of raw materials and consumer of manufactured goods. In Ghana, she revealed, similar operations have been suppressing cocoa farmer cooperatives that threaten to bypass international commodity markets. In Mali, educational aid has been carefully structured to ensure that the most promising students are channeled into foreign universities, creating a permanent brain drain. The screen displayed an intricate map of Africa with red lines connecting dozens of aid organizations, mining companies, and political figures across the continent. The pattern was unmistakable, a web of control spanning from Senegal to Somalia, from Libya to South Africa. But we are not victims, Ibrahim interjected, his voice rising with passion. We are the descendants of great kingdoms, of scholars who taught mathematics to Europe, of traders who connected continents. We have been made to forget our strength, but we have not lost it. In the crowd, a young student named Musa felt something awaken inside him. His grandfather had often told him stories of the great empires of Ouagadougou and Timbuktu, but Western education had taught him these were primitive societies saved by colonialism. Now, seeing his president speak with such power and clarity, those stories took on new meaning. Tonight we reclaim our narrative, Ibrahim declared. Tonight we begin the process of true liberation, not just from colonial occupation, but from neo-colonial manipulation. The broadcast was being watched by hundreds of millions of people worldwide. In university dormitories across Africa, students gathered around screens, their faces illuminated by the glow of revelation. In diaspora communities from London to Toronto to Dubai, Africans felt a stirring of pride they hadn't experienced in years. But the reaction wasn't uniformly positive. In certain corridors of power, Ibrahim's words were received as a declaration of war. Within hours of Ibrahim's broadcast, the international response was swift and predictable. The United Nations issued a strongly worded statement calling the allegations baseless conspiracy theories and demanding that Burkina Faso provide evidence through proper diplomatic channels. Major international news outlets, despite having aired the broadcast live, began running analysis pieces questioning Ibrahim's mental state and suggesting that the pressure of leadership had led to paranoid delusions. Opinion pieces appeared with headlines like "The Dangerous Isolation of Burkina Faso" and "When African Leaders Turn Against Progress." But something unexpected happened. The African Union, instead of distancing itself from Ibrahim's claims, called an emergency session. Leaders from across the continent demanded to examine the evidence for themselves. In Nigeria, President Bola Tinubu convened his Security Council after reports surfaced of similar patterns in humanitarian operations there. If even half of what Traore claims is true, he told his advisors, we need to reevaluate every international partnership we have. Kenya's President William Ruto ordered an immediate audit of all foreign aid organizations operating within Kenyan borders. We cannot afford to be naive about the intentions of those who claim to help us, he announced at a press conference in Nairobi. Meanwhile, in Ouagadougou, Ibrahim and Amara worked through the night in a secure underground facility beneath the presidential palace. The room was a marvel of modern technology hidden beneath centuries-old architecture, a fitting metaphor for the new Africa they envisioned. "The counter-narrative is already being constructed," Amara reported, scrolling, "through international news feeds on multiple screens. They're portraying you as an unstable dictator who's turning against the international community." Ibrahim nodded grimly. "That's exactly what we expected. The question is, are our people strong enough to resist the psychological warfare that's about to be unleashed?" His answer came sooner than expected. Across Burkina Faso, spontaneous rallies erupted in support of their president. In Bobo Dioulasso, the country's second-largest city, thousands marched through the streets carrying signs reading "Truth over Aid" and "Africa for Africans." In smaller towns and villages, traditional chiefs held council meetings discussing Ibrahim's revelations and their implications for their communities, but the enemy's response was equally swift and far more dangerous. 3 days after the broadcast, Ibrahim's security detail intercepted a coded message that chilled them to the bone. A 5-man assassination team had been deployed to Ouagadougou with orders to eliminate both Ibrahim and Amara before the evidence could spread further. Captain Seydou Ouedraogo, head of presidential security, burst into Ibrahim's office at dawn. "Sir, we have a problem. Multiple intelligence sources confirm foreign operatives have entered the country. They're not here to negotiate." Ibrahim, who had been reviewing economic reports while sipping strong Burkinabe coffee, set down his cup with steady hands. "How much time do we have?" "Unknown, sir. But they're professionals. Former special forces from multiple countries. This isn't some amateur operation." Amara, who had been sleeping in a secure guest room in the palace, was awakened and briefed immediately. As they discussed security protocols, an explosion rocked the building. Not close enough to cause structural damage, but near enough to send a clear message. "The water treatment facility," Captain Ouedraogo reported breathlessly. "They've destroyed the main pumping station for the eastern districts. Thousands of people are without clean water." Ibrahim's jaw tightened. "They're not just trying to kill us. They're trying to turn our people against us by creating a humanitarian crisis." Their strategy was diabolical in its simplicity. By destroying infrastructure and blaming it on Ibrahim's reckless accusations against international aid, they could create suffering that would make the population question their president's judgment. But Ibrahim had learned to think several moves ahead. "Mobilize every engineer in the military. We rebuild that facility in 48 hours, and I want every international journalist in the country to see us doing it with our own resources, our own expertise." As military engineers worked around the clock to restore water service, something remarkable happened. Ordinary citizens began arriving at the worksite with tools, materials, and labor. A grandmother brought tea for the workers. Students carried sandbags. Business owners contributed generators and equipment. Amara watched the scene unfold and felt something she hadn't experienced in years of undercover work: genuine hope. "They're not just supporting you," she told Ibrahim as they observed the reconstruction efforts. "They're reclaiming ownership of their own country." But the assassination team was still out there, and intelligence suggested they were preparing for a coordinated strike during the water facility's reopening ceremony. The cat-and-mouse game between Ibrahim's security forces and the foreign operatives played out across Ouagadougou's maze-like markets and residential quarters. Captain Ouedraogo had deployed plainclothes agents throughout the city, while Amara used her network of contacts to gather intelligence on the assassins' movements. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Kofi, a 12-year-old street child who survived by his wits and intimate knowledge of the city's hidden passages, approached one of Amara's agents with urgent information. "Madame," he whispered in rapid Moray, "the white men with guns are staying in the old colonial house, near the embassy quarter. I saw them cleaning weapons and studying pictures of our president. The colonial house, a remnant from French rule that had been converted into an upscale guest house, was the perfect cover. Hidden in plain sight among diplomatic residences and international business offices, it would attract little attention from casual observers. Amara immediately understood the tactical advantage of the location. "They chose well," she told Ibrahim during an emergency security briefing. "From there, they have multiple escape routes, proximity to diplomatic protection if needed, and clear sight lines to several government buildings." "Then we give them what they're looking for," Ibrahim replied, a dangerous glint in his eyes. The plan was audacious. Ibrahim would announce a public ceremony at the restored water facility, creating an irresistible target for the assassination team. But unknown to them, the real ceremony would be held at a different location, while a heavily armed counter-terrorism unit surrounded the colonial house. As dawn broke on the planned ceremony day, the operation began. Ibrahim, wearing a bulletproof vest beneath his traditional grand boo-boo, appeared to depart for the water facility with a full motorcade. Meanwhile, Amara led a separate team toward the colonial house, moving through the early morning shadows of Ouagadougou's awakening streets. The assassins took the bait. As Ibrahim's decoy convoy approached the water facility, long-range surveillance spotted movement on nearby rooftops. The would-be killers had positioned themselves for a clean shot at the ceremony platform, but instead of Ibrahim, they found themselves surrounded by some of Africa's most elite soldiers, men who had fought against terrorist insurgencies across the Sahel and who took the threat against their president very personally. The firefight was brief but intense. When it ended, 3 of the 5 assassins were dead, 1 was critically wounded, and 1 had been captured alive. More importantly, the operation yielded a treasure trove of intelligence that would expose the assassination plot's international connections. The captured assassin, under interrogation, revealed information that stunned even Ibrahim's most experienced intelligence officers. The operation hadn't just been funded by foreign intelligence agencies. It had been facilitated by someone within Ibrahim's own inner circle. "We need to consider the possibility," Colonel Diabate said during a closed-door security meeting, "that someone very close to you has been compromised." The revelation cast a shadow of suspicion over everyone in the presidential palace. Staff members who had worked together for years now eyed each other with distrust. The paranoia was exactly what the enemy had hoped to achieve. Even if the assassination failed, they could cripple the government from within. Amara proposed a psychological trap. "We feed different pieces of false information to different people," she suggested. "Whatever information shows up in enemy communications tells us who the traitor is." The operation took 2 weeks to execute. False plans were shared about secret meetings, fictional evidence caches, and imaginary safe houses. Each piece of disinformation was tailored to a specific individual's access level and responsibilities. The results were heartbreaking. The traitor was Musa Ouedraogo, Ibrahim's former classmate at the military academy and his closest friend since childhood. Musa had been recruited 3 years earlier when his daughter was studying abroad, and her student visa was threatened unless he cooperated with certain research requests. The confrontation took place in Ibrahim's private study, surrounded by books on African history and philosophy that the 2 friends had discussed for hours during their youth. "Why, Musa?" Ibrahim asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "We grew up together. We swore oaths together. We dreamed of this day when Africa would be free." Musa, a broken man in his 40s with graying temples and eyes full of shame, slumped in the leather chair across from his former friend. "They had my daughter, Ibrahim. When she applied for graduate school in Paris, they said her application could be expedited in exchange for small favors. Information about your schedule, your meetings, your state of mind. It seemed harmless at first, and then the favors grew larger. They wanted details about security protocols, advance notice of policy announcements, copies of diplomatic Correspondence. They said if I refused, not only would my daughter be expelled, but she would be arrested on fabricated terrorism charges. Ibrahim felt his heart breaking for his friend, even as anger burned in his chest. You could have come to me. We could have found a solution. With what power? Against their immigration systems, their universities, their legal frameworks? Ibrahim, they control everything that matters to a father trying to give his child a better life. The tragedy of Musa's situation revealed the insidious nature of the control system they were fighting. It wasn't just about military force or economic pressure. It was about making African leaders feel powerless to protect even their own families without foreign permission. Your daughter will be brought home safely, Ibrahim promised. We have allies you don't know about, resources you haven't imagined. But Musa, his voice hardened. The betrayal ends now. While dealing with the betrayal within his inner circle, Ibrahim was simultaneously orchestrating something unprecedented in modern African politics, a true continental alliance based on shared resistance to neo-colonial manipulation. The secure conference room beneath the palace hosted a virtual meeting that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. President Felix Tshisekedi of the Democratic Republic of Congo appeared on screen from Kinshasa, flanked by his top mining officials. From Accra, Ghana's President Nana Akufo-Addo joined the call, his expression grave but determined. The evidence you've shared is disturbing but not surprising, President Tshisekedi said. We've suspected similar operations in the DRC for years. Our cobalt and copper mining agreements have terms that never quite make sense from an economic standpoint. President Akufo-Addo nodded in agreement. In Ghana, we've noticed that every time we move toward processing our gold domestically, rather than exporting raw ore, we face sudden infrastructure problems, labor disputes that seem artificially escalated, and international pressure about environmental concerns. The conversation revealed a pattern of economic manipulation that spanned the continent. Countries rich in resources were systematically prevented from developing value-added industries. Educational aid was structured to produce graduates who could serve foreign corporations but not build domestic capacity. Infrastructure projects were designed to facilitate extraction rather than support local development. The question, said President Paul Kagame, joining from Rwanda, is whether we have the collective will to break free from these systems, knowing the cost will be severe. Ibrahim leaned forward. The cost of resistance cannot be higher than the cost of continued subjugation. Our children deserve to inherit wealth from their own land, not poverty in the midst of plenty. Over the following weeks, the alliance took concrete shape. The participating countries began sharing intelligence about suspicious aid operations, coordinating their responses to international pressure, and developing joint strategies for resource development. Most significantly, they began work on Ibrahim's most ambitious project, the United Africa Passport. The concept was revolutionary, a travel document that would allow free movement between participating African countries, facilitating trade, education, and cultural exchange without requiring approval from former colonial powers or international organizations. For too long, Ibrahim explained in a continent-wide address, our people have needed permission from London, Paris, or Washington to visit their neighbors. A Senegalese scholar cannot easily study in Nigeria. A Kenyan entrepreneur cannot easily trade with Ethiopia. We have been divided by borders that serve others' interests, not our own. The passport design itself was a work of art and symbolism. Created by a team of African artists, historians, and security experts, it featured imagery from across the continent: the pyramids of Egypt and Sudan, the rock churches of Ethiopia, the great Zimbabwe ruins, the mud brick architecture of Timbuktu, and the modern skylines of Lagos and Nairobi. But the passport was more than symbolic. It represented a fundamental challenge to the global system of movement control that had kept Africa fragmented and dependent. The international reaction was immediate and hostile. The European Union warned of security concerns and threatened visa restrictions for citizens of participating countries. The United States expressed deep concern about uncontrolled movement that could facilitate terrorism. These responses only strengthened African resolve. They fear African unity more than anything else, Amara observed during a strategy meeting, because they know that a truly united Africa would be an economic powerhouse that they couldn't control. The first United Africa passports were issued in a ceremony that drew thousands to Place de la Nation. Ibrahim and Amara stood together as the first recipients, their documents bearing the serial numbers RUX-1 and 0RUX-2. This passport, Ibrahim declared, holding his document high, represents more than travel convenience. It represents our commitment to each other, our recognition that artificial borders cannot divide the African spirit. But even as celebrations erupted across participating countries, intelligence reports warned of a massive counter-operation being planned by the exposed network. The enemy's response was swift, sophisticated, and brutal. Within a week of the passport launch, a carefully orchestrated disinformation campaign flooded social media platforms with fabricated evidence of corruption within Ibrahim's government. Deepfake videos showed Ibrahim meeting with known terrorist leaders. Forged documents suggested that Amara was actually a foreign agent working for competing intelligence services. Most damaging of all, fake financial records implied that the entire anti-colonial movement was actually funded by China as part of a bid to replace Western influence with Chinese control. The disinformation was crafted by psychological warfare experts who understood exactly how to exploit existing fears and divisions within African societies. They played on concerns about government corruption, ethnic tensions, and economic uncertainty. The sophistication is remarkable, noted Dr. Kwame Asante, a media analysis expert at the University of Ghana who had been asked to study the disinformation campaign. They're using artificial intelligence to create content that's almost impossible to distinguish from authentic material. But the architects of the campaign had underestimated something crucial, the deep reservoir of trust that Ibrahim had built with his people through years of consistent action and transparent governance. When the fake videos began circulating, ordinary Burkinabe citizens became amateur detective networks, examining the footage for inconsistencies and exposing the fabrications. A group of university students in Ouagadougou created a viral social media campaign called Off Real or Fake that systematically debunked the false evidence. Most powerfully, people who had personally witnessed Ibrahim's character and actions came forward to defend him. Fatima, the elderly woman who had lost her son to insurgent attacks, recorded a video message that was viewed millions of times across Africa. I have lived through colonialism, independence, coups, and foreign interventions, she said, her weathered face filled with dignity and strength. I know the difference between a leader who serves his people and one who serves outsiders. President Traore has given us back our pride. No false video will change what I see with my own eyes. As the disinformation campaign faltered, the network escalated to more desperate measures. Intelligence intercepts revealed plans for a biological attack that would be blamed on Ibrahim's government, providing justification for international intervention. They're planning to release a modified strain of dengue fever in the capital, reported Colonel Diabate during an emergency briefing. The modifications would make it more contagious but less lethal, enough to create panic and international condemnation without causing mass casualties that would trigger independent investigations. The audacity of the plan was breathtaking. By creating a public health crisis and then positioning international humanitarian organizations as the only credible responders, the network could rebuild its credibility while discrediting Ibrahim's government as incompetent and dangerous. But Amara's years of inside knowledge proved invaluable. I know the team they'll use, she revealed. Dr. Marcus Peterson from the Disease Prevention Institute. He's been developing modified pathogens, under humanitarian cover for years. If we can intercept him before he reaches the deployment stage. The operation to stop the biological attack required cooperation between Burkina Faso's military, local health officials, and intelligence assets from allied African countries. It was a test of whether the new Continental Alliance could function under extreme pressure. Working through the night, teams of soldiers and medical experts tracked down the laboratory where the modified dengue strain was being prepared. The facility was hidden within a legitimate medical research compound on the outskirts of Ouagadougou, camouflaged behind real malaria prevention work. The raid was executed with surgical precision. Dr. Peterson and 3 accomplices were captured, along with samples of the modified pathogen and detailed plans for its release. More importantly, the seized documents revealed the full scope of similar operations planned for other African countries. This is biological warfare disguised as humanitarian response, Ibrahim announced in an emergency broadcast. They were prepared to make our children sick to justify their continued presence in our country. The evidence was undeniable. Laboratory records showed the deliberate modification of natural pathogens to create controllable epidemics. Communication logs revealed coordination with media outlets to ensure maximum psychological impact from the planned outbreak. The international community's response to these revelations marked a turning point in global opinion. As evidence of the biological warfare plot spread worldwide, something unprecedented happened. Elements within Western governments and institutions began breaking ranks to support Ibrahim's accusations. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a British epidemiologist who had worked with the Disease Prevention Institute for 15 years, held a press conference in London that stunned the international medical community. "I can no longer remain silent," she declared, her voice shaking with emotion. "For years I believed we were engaged in legitimate disease prevention work. But the documents revealed by President Traore show operations that violate every principle of medical ethics and international law." Her testimony was particularly powerful because she had been unaware of the darker aspects of her organization's work. Her genuine shock and horror at the revelations lent credibility to Ibrahim's claims among previously skeptical Western audiences. Similar confessions emerged from other sources. James Rodriguez, a former logistics coordinator for Global Health Alliance, revealed how medical supply chains were deliberately designed to maintain dependency rather than build local capacity. "We would ship expensive equipment that required specialized maintenance," he testified before the European Parliament. "But we would never train local technicians or establish supply chains for replacement parts. When the equipment broke down, as it inevitably did, communities would be more desperate for our help than before we arrived." The psychological impact of these insider testimonies was enormous. They came from people who had believed they were doing good work, making their revelations all the more powerful. In African capitals, the mood was one of vindication, mixed with determination. President Hakainde Hichilema of Zambia announced the immediate suspension of all foreign aid programs pending comprehensive audits. "We must examine every partnership, every agreement, every promise of help to determine whether we are truly being helped or merely being helped to remain dependent." With international attention focused on the humanitarian aid scandal, Ibrahim and his allies moved quickly to implement their most ambitious economic reforms. The goal was to demonstrate that African countries could prosper without the systems of dependency that had been disguised as development assistance. The Burkina Faso Economic Sovereignty Initiative became a model for the continent. Instead of exporting raw gold to be processed elsewhere, the government established domestic refineries and jewelry manufacturing facilities. Rather than shipping uranium ore abroad, they developed partnerships with other African countries to build nuclear power plants that would serve regional energy needs. "Every dollar we earn from our resources should multiply within our borders before flowing elsewhere," Ibrahim explained during the launch of the program. "We sell finished goods, not raw materials. We export expertise, not just commodities." Third, initiative's success exceeded all expectations. Within 6 months, unemployment in Burkina Faso dropped by 30% as new industries created skilled jobs for local workers. Government revenues increased dramatically as value-added exports commanded higher prices than raw materials. More importantly, the program demonstrated that African countries could achieve rapid economic development without relying on foreign aid or investment that came with political strings attached. Ghana quickly adopted similar policies for its cocoa industry, establishing processing facilities that produced finished chocolate products for export to global markets. Nigeria leveraged its oil resources to develop petrochemical industries that served African markets instead of simply exporting crude oil. We are witnessing the birth of a new African economic order, observed Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, the former African Union chairperson, during a conference in Addis Ababa. For the first time since independence, African countries are truly controlling their economic destinies, recognizing that information control was as important as economic control. Ibrahim and Amara launched an ambitious project to create African-owned digital infrastructure. The continent's internet traffic had been routed through overseas servers controlled by foreign corporations, making every email, every social media post, and every digital transaction visible to outside monitoring. Digital sovereignty is as important as territorial sovereignty, Amara explained during the launch of the African Internet Initiative. When our communications flow through foreign-controlled infrastructure, we are never truly free. Working with technology companies from South Africa, Kenya, and Egypt, the initiative established a continental fiber optic network that kept African internet traffic within Africa. New data centers in multiple countries provided cloud services that competed directly with foreign providers. The project's success attracted some of Africa's brightest minds who had been working abroad. Dr. Neka Okoro, a Nigerian computer scientist who had been leading artificial intelligence research in Silicon Valley, returned to Lagos to establish an AI development center focused on African languages and cultural contexts. For too long, artificial intelligence has been developed by non-Africans using non-African data, she explained. The result is technology that doesn't understand our languages, our cultures, or our needs. We're changing that. The Digital Liberation Project faced immediate resistance. International technology corporations lobbied their governments to impose sanctions on participating African countries. Cyber attacks targeted the new infrastructure, attempting to prove that African-controlled systems were inherently insecure. But each attack only strengthened African resolve and expertise. Young programmers from across the continent contributed to defense systems that proved more robust than many Western alternatives. As Ibrahim's movement gained momentum, the battle for narrative control intensified. International media outlets that had initially dismissed his claims as conspiracy theories were forced to confront mounting evidence of the humanitarian aid network's true purposes. CNN's chief international correspondent, Christiane Amanpour, arrived in Ouagadougou to conduct what many expected would be a confrontational interview designed to discredit Ibrahim's claims. Instead, she found herself documenting one of the most significant political stories of the decade. President Traoré, she began during their televised interview, critics say you're endangering international cooperation by promoting conspiracy theories about humanitarian organizations. How do you respond? Ibrahim's response was measured and thoughtful. Ms. Amanpour, I would ask those critics to explain why humanitarian organizations need encrypted military-grade communication equipment, why medical supply warehouses contain surveillance devices and weapons, why aid workers meet secretly with known insurgent leaders. He leaned forward, his eyes never leaving the camera. I'm not against international cooperation. I'm against international deception. There's a difference between partnership and manipulation, between assistance and control. Amanpour, known for her tough interviews with world leaders, found herself genuinely moved by the evidence Ibrahim presented during their conversation. When the interview aired globally, It shifted international opinion in ways the network hadn't anticipated. But the media war was far from over. The network's response was to flood African airwaves with programming designed to create doubt and division. Radio stations across the Sahel began broadcasting messages in local languages, warning that Ibrahim's policies would lead to isolation, poverty, and conflict. "Your president is leading you toward disaster," the broadcasts claimed. "Without international aid, hospitals will close, schools will shut down, and your children will suffer." The psychological pressure was intense. Many Burkina citizens, despite supporting Ibrahim's goals, worried about the practical consequences of confronting the global power structure. It was Amara who conceived the counter-strategy. "We don't fight their propaganda with propaganda," she told Ibrahim during a late-night planning session. "We fight it with results." The strategy was simple but effective. Demonstrate immediate, visible improvements in people's lives using purely African resources and expertise. Every school that stayed open without foreign funding, every clinic that provided better care with locally trained doctors, every infrastructure project completed with continental cooperation became a powerful argument against dependency. The water treatment facility that had been destroyed in the initial attack became a symbol of this new approach. Rebuilt entirely with Burkina engineering and materials sourced from other African countries, it not only restored water service but expanded it to neighborhoods that had never had reliable access. "This facility serves 50,000 more people than the original," Ibrahim announced during its opening ceremony. "It was built by our engineers with our materials, funded by our resources. And unlike the previous facility, no foreign power can threaten to shut it down if they disapprove of our policies." Similar projects multiplied across the country. Solar power installations built with panels manufactured in Morocco and batteries from South African lithium provided electricity to rural communities that had waited decades for grid connections. Schools staffed entirely by African teachers, and administrators achieved higher literacy rates than those dependent on foreign assistance. The psychological impact was transformative. Citizens who had been told they needed outside help to solve basic problems discovered they had always possessed the knowledge, skills, and resources necessary for development. They had simply been prevented from accessing and coordinating them, Dr. Aminata Traoré, the internationally renowned economist and former culture minister of Mali, visited Ouagadougou to document the changes. Her subsequent report, published simultaneously in journals across Africa, provided academic validation for what ordinary citizens were experiencing daily. "What we are witnessing in Burkina Faso is not just policy reform," she wrote. "It is the practical demonstration that African development problems have African solutions. The dependency narrative that has dominated for 60 years is being systematically debunked by reality." The network's growing desperation manifested in increasingly direct attempts to eliminate Ibrahim. The biological warfare plot had failed, the disinformation campaign had backfired, and economic pressure was proving ineffective against countries that had reduced their dependency on external systems. The assassination attempt came during Ibrahim's visit to Bobo Dioulasso for the opening of a new university built through inter-African cooperation. As his motorcade traveled the main highway between the capital and the country's economic center, it was ambushed by a sophisticated operation involving explosives, sniper fire, and coordinated vehicle attacks. Ibrahim's survival was due partly to exceptional security preparation and partly to the loyalty of ordinary citizens who had noticed unusual activity along the route and reported it to authorities. A group of motorcycle taxi drivers had observed strangers installing what appeared to be maintenance equipment on cell phone towers, equipment that was actually sophisticated surveillance and targeting technology. The attack itself was fierce but brief. As explosions rocked the highway and gunfire erupted from multiple directions, Ibrahim's security detail executed emergency protocols that had been rehearsed dozens of times. Armored vehicles deployed smoke screens while helicopters provided air support and medical evacuation capabilities. When the smoke cleared, 6 attackers were dead and 2 had been captured. More importantly, the attack had been recorded by multiple news crews who were following the presidential convoy, providing undeniable evidence of the network's willingness to resort to direct violence. "They have shown their true nature," Ibrahim declared from his hospital bed, where he was being treated for minor injuries from flying debris. "When deception fails, they choose murder. When they cannot control, they seek to destroy." The assassination attempt had an effect opposite to what the network intended. Instead of intimidating other African leaders, it galvanized them. Within hours, presidents from across the continent issued joint statements condemning the attack and pledging increased cooperation with Ibrahim's initiatives. 6 months after Ibrahim's initial revelation, the First Continental Congress of Free Africa convened in Ouagadougou. Representatives from 37 African countries gathered to formalize their resistance to neo-colonial manipulation and establish frameworks for genuine cooperation. The Congress was held in the Palace of Culture, a striking building that combined traditional Burkina architecture with modern conference facilities. Delegates arrived carrying the new United Africa passports, symbolically demonstrating the practical success of continental integration. President Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa delivered the opening address, his words carrying the weight of his country's experience with international isolation and economic pressure. "We know the cost of standing alone against global systems of control," he declared, "but we also know the greater cost of accepting permanent subjugation. Today, we choose the difficult path of freedom over the easy path of dependency." The Congress established several groundbreaking institutions. The African Monetary Cooperation Authority would coordinate efforts to reduce dependence on foreign currencies and develop regional payment systems. The Continental Infrastructure Development Bank would finance projects using African resources and expertise. The African Educational Excellence Initiative would create scholarship programs that kept promising students within the continent while providing world-class education. But the most significant achievement was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for colonial and neo-colonial crimes. This body would systematically document and expose decades of manipulation, extraction, and control that had been hidden behind humanitarian and development rhetoric. "We are not seeking revenge," Ibrahim explained during his address to the Congress. "We are seeking acknowledgement, accountability, and assurance that these practices will end. The truth is not our enemy. Deception is." The Commission's first report, released just 2 months later, contained evidence that shocked even experienced African political leaders. The systematic nature of the control mechanisms, the coordination between supposedly independent organizations, and the long-term planning involved in maintaining African dependency were revealed in extraordinary detail. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission's revelations triggered a crisis within the United Nations itself. Secretary General Antonio Guterres faced calls for his resignation as evidence emerged of his knowledge of questionable humanitarian operations. More significantly, several European governments began internal investigations of their own agencies' involvement in the exposed networks. The Dutch government discovered that its Foreign Aid Ministry had been facilitating intelligence operations under humanitarian cover. Norway's parliament launched hearings into similar activities by Norwegian aid organizations. "We cannot claim to support human rights and development while secretly undermining the sovereignty of the very countries we claim to help," declared Norwegian Prime Minister Jonas Gahr Støre during an emotional parliamentary session. The most dramatic moment came when Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the British epidemiologist who had first broken ranks, testified before the UN Security Council. Her presentation included detailed documentation of how disease prevention programs had been used to gather biological data that could be weaponized against African populations. "We told ourselves we were saving lives," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "But we were actually gathering intelligence for potential biological warfare operations. The moral corruption is complete and undeniable." Her testimony was broadcast live across Africa, where millions watched a Western scientist, confirming their president's most serious allegations. The vindication was profound, but so was the realization of how close they had come to catastrophic manipulation. Rather than simply rejecting all international cooperation, Ibrahim and the Continental Congress developed a new model for global engagement based on equality, transparency, and mutual respect. The African Partnership Protocols established clear principles for any international organization seeking to work in participating countries. All aid programs would be jointly designed and managed by African institutions. Financial flows would be completely transparent, with real-time auditing by African oversight bodies. No foreign organization would be permitted to operate independently of local partnerships and supervision. "We are not closing our doors to the world," Ibrahim explained during the protocol's unveiling. "We are opening them only to those who come as genuine partners, not as masters disguised as helpers." The new model attracted interest from unexpected quarters. Several Scandinavian countries, genuinely committed to equitable development, adapted their aid programs to meet the new requirements. Brazil and India, as fellow developing nations, established South-South cooperation agreements that respected African sovereignty. Most significantly, Chinese engagement with Africa began to shift as Beijing recognized that the new African assertiveness created opportunities for more balanced partnerships. Unlike the exposed Western networks that relied on maintaining African weakness, China's long-term interests were better served by African prosperity and stability. 1 year after Ibrahim's initial broadcast, Burkina Faso's economic indicators told a story that confounded traditional development economists. Despite losing virtually all Western aid funding, the country's GDP had grown by 12%. Child mortality rates had continued declining as locally managed health systems proved more effective than foreign-administered programs. The secret was the multiplier effect of keeping resources within African control. Money that had previously flowed out of the continent in the form of consultant fees, equipment purchases, and debt service was now circulating within African economies, creating jobs and stimulating innovation. The United Africa Passport had facilitated unprecedented regional trade. Burkina gold was now processed into jewelry in Ghana, using designs that celebrated African cultural heritage and commanded premium prices in global markets. Malian cotton was woven into textiles in Nigerian factories, creating finished products that competed successfully with Asian imports. "We are discovering what every other continent already knew," observed economist Dr. Vera Songwe during a conference in Dakar. Economic development happens when value addition occurs close to resource extraction, when skilled labor is developed locally, and when profits are reinvested in domestic capacity building. The transformation wasn't limited to large-scale industry. Small farmers began forming cooperatives that processed agricultural products for regional markets. Artisans established guilds that preserved traditional crafts while adapting them for contemporary needs. Young entrepreneurs launched technology companies that solved uniquely African problems with African innovations. Despite the political and economic successes, the struggle had exacted a severe personal toll on Ibrahim and those closest to him. The constant security threats meant he could rarely move freely within his own country. His relationship with his family had become complicated by the need for their protection and the demands of his historic mission. Amara, too, had paid a price for her role in exposing the network. Her former colleagues in international organizations viewed her as a traitor, while some Africans questioned whether someone with her background could truly be trusted. She lived in a liminal space between two worlds, fully accepted by neither. The emotional weight of their responsibilities came to a head during a quiet evening in the palace gardens. Ibrahim and Amara sat beneath a centuries-old mango tree, watching stars emerge in the clear African sky. "Sometimes I wonder if we've chosen the hardest possible path," Ibrahim said quietly. "We could have negotiated, compromised, found ways to work within their systems. Amara was silent for a long moment before responding. When I was working undercover, I saw a child die in a clinic while medicine that could have saved her was sitting in a warehouse, withheld because her village had voted for the wrong candidate in local elections. In that moment, I knew that some systems can't be reformed, they can only be replaced. Ibrahim nodded slowly. The ancestors who fought against colonial conquest faced similar choices. They could have accepted subjugation in exchange for personal comfort, or they could have fought for freedom knowing they might not live to see it. And they chose freedom, Amara finished. As must we. Their conversation was interrupted by urgent news from Captain Ouedraogo. Sir, we've received intelligence about a massive operation being planned against the Continental Congress. Multiple countries are being targeted simultaneously. The intelligence was chilling in its scope and ambition. The network, recognizing that its previous tactics had failed, was preparing a continent-wide operation designed to destabilize all countries participating in the new African alliance. The plan, codenamed Operation Restore Order, involved synchronized attacks on infrastructure, coordinated disinformation campaigns, and the activation of sleeper cells that had been embedded in African societies for years. The goal was to create enough chaos and suffering to justify massive international intervention that would permanently end the independence movement. They're planning to attack power grids, water systems, communication networks, and transportation hubs across 15 countries simultaneously, reported intelligence analyst Dr. Fatoumata Keita during an emergency session of the Continental Defense Coordination Committee. The scale of the planned operation revealed the network's true strength and desperation. Resources that had been built up over decades would be expended in a single, overwhelming assault designed to prove that African countries could not maintain stability without foreign oversight. But the network had underestimated how much African intelligence capabilities had improved through continental cooperation. Information sharing between allied countries allowed analysts to piece together the complete picture of the planned attacks. "We have a choice," Ibrahim told the Emergency Assembly of African Leaders meeting via secure video conference. "We can try to defend against this attack reactively, or we can take preemptive action to neutralize the threat." The decision to move proactively was unanimous, but it required the most sophisticated intelligence and military operation in modern African history. The operation to prevent restore order stretched across multiple time zones and involved coordination between intelligence services, military units, and civilian security forces from across Africa. It was a test of whether the new African alliance could function as an effective defense network. In Lagos, Nigerian special forces raided compounds where mercenaries had been preparing attacks on oil facilities. In Nairobi, Kenyan intelligence arrested sleeper agents who had been planning to sabotage the city's financial district. In Johannesburg, South African authorities uncovered a weapons cache that would have supplied urban warfare for months. But the most critical operation took place in Burkina Faso itself, where Amara led a joint task force to capture the network's Continental Command Center, hidden beneath a seemingly innocent agricultural research facility outside Ouagadougou. The facility's underground complex was a marvel of covert engineering. Fiber, optic connections to global communication networks, secure conference rooms for coordinating operations across Africa, and sophisticated computer systems for managing the continent-wide network of agents and assets. "This is the nerve center," Amara reported as her team systematically secured the facility. "Everything flows through here: funding, communications, operational orders, intelligence assessments." The computers contained terabytes of data documenting decades of operations across Africa. Financial records showed how aid budgets had been used to fund political manipulation. Communication logs revealed coordination between humanitarian organizations and intelligence agencies. Most shocking of all, strategic planning documents outlined long-term goals for maintaining African dependency. Well into the 22nd century, they weren't just trying to control current African governments, Dr. Keita observed as she analyzed the captured data. They were planning to ensure that Africa would never develop the capacity for genuine independence. The evidence captured during the Continental Defense Operation was so comprehensive and damning that it could not be dismissed or explained away. The network's own internal documents provided an unfiltered view of how they perceived Africa and Africans. One particularly revealing strategy document, authored by a senior coordinator at the International Development Cooperation Agency, contained language that shocked even hardened political observers. The key to maintaining stability in our African operations is ensuring that local populations never develop sufficient confidence in their own capabilities. Aid programs should provide enough improvement to prevent revolution while maintaining enough dependency to preclude independence. Another document outlined psychological warfare techniques designed to convince Africans that their traditional systems of governance, economics, and social organization were inherently inferior to Western models. Cultural programming must emphasize the narrative that pre-colonial African societies were primitive and chaotic, the document stated. This ensures that local populations view foreign intervention as necessary and beneficial, rather than exploitative. When these documents were published in their entirety by major African newspapers, the reaction was explosive. University students across the continent organized protests demanding that their curricula be revised to include accurate African history. Traditional leaders called for the restoration of indigenous governance systems that had been suppressed during the colonial era. The psychological liberation was as significant as the political liberation. For the first time in generations, Africans began questioning fundamental assumptions about their own capabilities and potential. As the second year of the liberation movement progressed, economic indicators across participating African countries defied every prediction made by international development experts. Countries that had been warned of imminent collapse due to aid withdrawal instead experienced unprecedented growth. Burkina Faso's transformation was particularly dramatic. The country's gold industry, now entirely under domestic control, generated 5 times more revenue than it had under foreign management. The difference was simple. Instead of exporting raw ore at commodity prices, Burkina Faso was exporting finished jewelry and electronics components at premium prices. The literacy rate increased by 20% as schools funded by domestics, resources and staffed by properly compensated African teachers proved more effective than their foreign-funded predecessors. Healthcare outcomes improved as medical training programs focused on diseases common in Africa rather than conditions prevalent in donor countries. We are witnessing the fastest economic transformation in modern African history, noted World Bank economist Dr. Albert Zufak, whose analysis of the new African model had been initially skeptical but became increasingly admiring as results accumulated. The success attracted global attention beyond the usual development community. Harvard Business School established a research program to study African innovation systems. MIT began collaborating with African universities on technology projects that addressed African priorities. But the most significant recognition came from an unexpected source. The Nobel Committee announced that Ibrahim and Amara would jointly receive the Peace Prize for their extraordinary contribution to international understanding and the peaceful resolution of conflicts between developed and developing nations. The Nobel Peace Prize ceremony in Oslo provided a global platform for Ibrahim to articulate his vision of a post-colonial world order. Standing before an audience that included kings, presidents, and Nobel laureates, he delivered an address that would be studied and quoted for generations. "Your Majesties, Excellencies, distinguished guests," he began, "I accept this honor not for myself, but for every African who has dared to dream of genuine freedom. This prize recognizes not just our struggle against neo-colonial manipulation, but our commitment to building a world where partnership replaces domination. His speech went beyond criticism to present a constructive vision for international relations based on equality and mutual respect. "We do not seek to exclude any nation or organization from cooperation with Africa," he explained, "but we insist that cooperation be based on African priorities, implemented through African institutions, and beneficial to African development rather than external exploitation." Amara's acceptance speech focused on the role of truth in creating sustainable peace. "For too long, international relations have been built on lies disguised as diplomacy," she said. "Powerful countries have claimed to help weaker ones while actually exploiting them. This hypocrisy has generated resentment, instability, and conflict around the world." She paused, scanning the distinguished audience before continuing. "True peace can only be built on truth. When we acknowledge honestly how international systems have operated, when we face the reality of how aid has sometimes been used as a tool of control, only then can we begin building relationships based on genuine mutual respect." The speech was broadcast live across Africa, where millions watched their representatives address the world from a position of strength and moral authority. The psychological impact was profound. Africans who had grown up believing they needed external validation for their achievements were seeing their leaders command global respect on their own terms. Following the Nobel recognition, African countries accelerated their development of continental institutions that could replace dependence on foreign-controlled organizations. The African Academy of Sciences established research centers focused on solving African problems with African solutions. The Continental Development Bank began funding infrastructure projects that connected African countries rather than simply facilitating resource extraction. Perhaps most significantly, the African Information and Communication Authority launched a continental news network that provided coverage of African affairs from African perspectives. For decades, international news about Africa had been filtered through foreign media outlets that often emphasized conflict, corruption, and chaos while ignoring progress, innovation, and achievement. The new network, broadcasting in dozens of African languages as well as international languages, told different stories. It covered scientific breakthroughs at African universities, cultural achievements by African artists, and economic successes by African entrepreneurs. Media representation shapes global perception, and global perception influences international policy, explained the network's director, Dr. Wole Soyinka Jr., son of the Nobel Literature Laureate. "For too long, Africa has been represented primarily through non-African lenses. We're changing that narrative." The network's coverage of African affairs began influencing international media, forcing Western outlets to provide more balanced reporting or risk being seen as biased and irrelevant. As Ibrahim's third year in office began, the most encouraging development was the emergence of a new generation of African leaders inspired by the liberation movement. Young politicians, entrepreneurs, artists, and activists across the continent were building on the foundation established by the Continental Congress. In Kenya, a 28-year-old software engineer named Grace Wanjiku launched a technology company that developed artificial intelligence solutions for African agricultural challenges. Her innovations helped small farmers optimize crop yields using locally relevant data and culturally appropriate interfaces. In Senegal, musician and activist Yassine Fall created the African Cultural Preservation Project, which documented traditional knowledge systems and demonstrated their relevance to contemporary challenges. Her work showed how indigenous African technologies could address modern problems in sustainable ways. In Rwanda, economist Dr. Jean-Claude Nzeyimana established the African Economic Sovereignty Institute, which trained government officials from across the continent in strategies for reducing economic dependency while maintaining beneficial international relationships. "What we're seeing is the emergence of an African Renaissance," observed historian Dr. Cheikh Anta Diop Université, Professor Dr. Babacar Diop. "Young Africans are combining the best of traditional knowledge with modern innovation to to create solutions that are authentically African, yet globally competitive. Ibrahim followed these developments with pride tempered by caution. The movement has grown beyond what any single leader can control, he told Amara during one of their regular evening discussions. That's both encouraging and concerning. Why concerning? She asked. Because success creates new challenges. As Africa becomes stronger and more unified, we become a greater threat to those who benefit from our weakness. The resistance we've faced so far may seem gentle compared to what's coming. His prescience would prove accurate sooner than anyone expected. The network's last desperate gambit was breathtaking in its audacity and terrifying in its potential consequences. Unable to stop the African liberation movement through conventional means, they prepared to trigger a continental war that would justify massive international intervention and the permanent occupation of key African territories. The plan, discovered through intelligence shared by sympathetic sources within Western governments, involved simultaneously assassinating several African presidents while staging false flag terrorist attacks that would be blamed on radical Islamic groups. The resulting chaos would provide justification for UN peacekeeping forces to establish permanent bases across the Sahel region. They're prepared to kill millions of Africans to maintain their control, reported Intelligence Chief Colonel Diabate during an emergency session of the Continental Defense Council. This isn't about politics anymore. It's about survival. The timeline was compressed. The assassinations were scheduled for the upcoming African Unity Day celebrations, when all participating presidents would be in their capitals addressing their nations simultaneously. Ibrahim faced the most difficult decision of his presidency. He could cancel the celebrations and hide, potentially saving lives but allowing the network to claim victory and maintain their operations. Or he could proceed with the ceremonies while implementing a counter-operation so comprehensive that it would finally destroy the network entirely. We end this now, he decided. All of it. Forever. The final confrontation took place not in the shadows, but in the full light of global attention, as African presidents delivered Unity Day addresses. Across the continent, simultaneous operations arrested hundreds of network operatives in dozens of countries. The evidence collected during these raids finally provided complete documentation of the conspiracy's scope and methods. The psychological impact was transformative. Africans who had grown up believing they needed external permission for their own development suddenly understood that they had always possessed everything necessary for prosperity and progress. Ibrahim's final address to the nation, delivered 1 year after his initial revelation, captured the magnitude of the transformation. My people, 1 year ago I told you that we had been deceived. Tonight I tell you that we have been liberated. Not by foreign saviors, not by international intervention, but by our own courage, our own wisdom, and our own determination to be free. The crowd in Place de la Nation was larger than ever, but the mood was different. Not desperate hope, but confident celebration. Children who had been born into the new era played in the square, while their parents discussed business partnerships with neighboring countries and educational opportunities that would keep African talent on African soil. The United Africa passport has become more than a travel document, Ibrahim continued. It has become a symbol of our commitment to each other and our determination to build a continent where every child can achieve their full potential without leaving home. As fireworks lit up the Ouagadougou sky and similar celebrations erupted, across Africa, the world witnessed the birth of a new era. The continent that had been written off as permanently dependent on outside assistance had proven that it possessed unlimited potential when allowed to control its own destiny. Amara, standing beside Ibrahim as they watched their people celebrate, smiled with satisfaction. The real victory isn't political or economic, she said. It's psychological. We've remembered who we are. Ibrahim nodded, his eyes reflecting the fireworks above. And that memory changes everything. the story of Burkina Faso's liberation had become Africa's story, a powerful reminder that freedom isn't granted by others, but claimed by those brave enough to demand it. As the celebrations continued into the night, a new dawn was breaking, not just over Ouagadougou, but over the entire continent. The united Africa they had envisioned was no longer a dream, but a reality, built not on the foundation of aid and dependency, but on the solid ground of truth, sovereignty, and unshakable determination. The future belonged to Africa, because Africans had finally decided to claim it. In the years that would follow, historians would mark Ibrahim's first broadcast as the moment when the post-colonial era truly ended and the era of African sovereignty began. The courage of one president and one undercover agent had ignited a continental transformation that would inspire liberation movements around the world. The sun that set behind the hills of Ouagadougou that first evening had witnessed the end of one chapter in African history. The sun that now rose over a free continent illuminated the beginning of another, one written by Africans, for Africans, in their own words and on their own terms. The battle for Africa's soul was won, but the greater victory was the realization that it had never needed to be fought. Africa had always been free. It had simply been convinced otherwise. Now, finally, the continent remembered its power, and the world would never be the same.